In 2025, the numbers are finally in, and they are harsher than most people imagined. IMF analysis shows that in the Philippines, nearly 89% of outsourced service jobs carry high automation risk, while in Bangladesh, some projects report losses of up to 80% of staff once AI systems take over. These industries aren't niche-side contracts, they fuel national economies. For millions, this isn't a career pivot, it feels like an economic cliff. Over the next minutes, we'll look at which jobs are already collapsing, where unexpected new roles are surfacing, and a few practical moves you can make now. And the story begins with the very jobs once thought untouchable by automation. Jobs that are now disappearing at unprecedented speed. When safe jobs vanish overnight. For years, many assumed that some kinds of work were protected from automation. They weren't glamorous roles, but they were steady ones. Answering phones in call centers, transcribing recordings, or handling customer complaints required fluency, patience, and a human ear for tone. These jobs provided millions of people in places like the Philippines and Bangladesh with dependable wages and gave governments reliable tax income. By 2025, however, that sense of stability is rapidly unraveling. What once looked like a pipeline of secure careers is now fragmenting within a matter of months rather than decades, leaving millions of trained workers holding skills that employers no longer seem to value. The latest data illustrates just how quickly this foundation is dissolving. In the Philippines, the IMF has identified business process outsourcing, worth around 7 to 8% of the country's GDP and employing roughly 1.7 million people, as one of the industries most exposed to automation risk. On the ground in Bangladesh, local reporting has tracked specific projects where workforce reductions reached astonishing levels almost immediately. One widely discussed case saw around 80% of staff dismissed after an AI-driven platform replaced their data labeling work. These are not theoretical projections set far in the future. They are present realities unfolding across entire sectors and even individual companies. This collapse is especially devastating because these were not peripheral roles in their economies, they were the backbone. In Manila, neighborhoods were built around call centers, sustained by late-night cafes and transport services serving young professionals. In Bangladesh, years of investment went into bootstrapping an English-speaking workforce able to attract contracts from global firms. That groundwork raised families into an emerging middle class. But when automation sweeps away such sectors in a short time, the impact is not just personal unemployment. It's an economic shock that reverberates through housing markets, consumer demand, and even the government's ability to pay off debts. The pace of adoption explains why collapse feels so compressed. Just a couple of years ago, analysts assumed gradual replacement. Predictions in 2023 suggested businesses would experiment cautiously, chipping away at human jobs incrementally. But the reality has looked far more like a sudden chain reaction. As soon as one outsourcing firm uses AI to cut its customer service costs, competitors feel compelled to follow or risk losing contracts. Corporate survival makes hesitation unbearable. And unlike the machines that reshaped manufacturing, today's software-based AI is globally deployable on day one. There is no need to build factories or shipping networks. It can run instantly at scale on remote servers. Rapid workplace adoption bears this out. Surveys in late 2024 showed that roughly 26% of workers in the US were already using generative AI in their jobs. While that survey focused on wealthier nations, the implications apply globally. The fastest adoption of a transformative technology in living memory is now dictating what employers everywhere expect. Instead of a decade-long curve, service industries have seen their projected timelines collapse into just a few years. The result is plain in worker experiences. In Dhaka, the clerks dismissed from the SkyTech labeling project represented hundreds of immediate job losses. In Manila, young graduates who finished training for their first call center roles sometimes discovered that the number of available positions had been cut in half even before their graduation ceremony. For those individuals, unemployment is no longer an abstract statistic. It is an abrupt stop at the very start of a planned career. And for governments, every lost contract means less foreign exchange coming in, leaving national budgets harder to balance. The qualities once thought to make these jobs resilient, language abilities, empathy, adaptability, ironically became the very benchmarks AI systems achieved fastest. Current platforms can not only parse free-flowing human conversation, but also simulate politeness, apology, and even emotional nuance in customer service exchanges. The same emotional signals that humans relied on to calm an angry customer are now replicated by software that pulls no salary and makes no errors born of fatigue. From the perspective of corporate spreadsheets, the decision does not even appear difficult. This is why the most intense wave of disruption is hitting countries that built their recent economic development on outsourced services. These economies once saw outsourcing as their substitute for missing out on the manufacturing booms of earlier decades. They doubled down by funding infrastructure, training, and educational programs tied directly to call centers, transcription services, and other forms of data processing. Families invested thousands on English programs for their children because the payoff seemed reliable. Now entire communities organized around these service industries are starting to feel deserted. The systemic risk expands far beyond payroll. Housing markets in major Philippine cities inflated in part because stable BPO salaries supported mortgages and rents. Retail businesses grew confident that a steady stream of young professionals would fuel consumer demand. Municipal budgets counted on corresponding tax receipts to fund services and public utilities. When contracts vanish quickly, each of those dependent layers starts to weaken at once. The issue is not only unemployment, but the potential unwinding of whole urban systems. And the pain isn't distributed evenly even within societies. Entry-level workers, often in their early 20s, are discovering that stepping stone jobs no longer exist, removing the rungs that previously led to supervisory roles or corporate advancement. Middle managers find their purpose eroded too, because if frontline staff are gone, hierarchy collapses with them. The ladder of mobility looks less like it's being climbed and more like it's being pulled away wholesale. At the same time, the shift illustrates how fragile development models can be when tethered so tightly to one sector. Outsourcing once acted as the reliable export for countries that lacked abundant industrial capacity. Suddenly, without physical assets or natural resources to cushion the fall, their profit engine has evaporated. That dynamic forces tough questions. If services can vanish through an update to software, what foundations remain for long-term economic planning? Put bluntly, in the Philippines, the IMF's warning about high exposure in business process outsourcing is not just theory. It represents over 1 million workers whose livelihoods face serious risk. In Bangladesh, companies like the Data Labeling Project, that cut 80% of its staff, embody how fast changes materialize on the ground. Together, these examples illustrate how fragile national progress can look once AI is scaled across industries that had, until quite recently, looked immune. And the hardest truth is that these early casualties of automation are already changing the shape of the global map. The story is no longer about whether AI threatens work. In many places, that question has already been answered. The challenge now is understanding what these shifts mean not only at the country level, but also for individuals watching their planned futures collapse. For viewers, that raises an unavoidable question. If whole sectors can unravel like this, what does survivability in your own career actually look like? That's where we now turn. Rich countries get richer, again. The fallout from AI isn't distributed evenly. It's drawing a line between nations that capture its rewards and those left with the losses. In 2025, that line has become impossible to miss. Wealthy economies such as the United States, Germany, South Korea, and increasingly China are reporting growth rates far above the global average, while many developing nations are watching their main engines of prosperity break down. It's not just that one group is accelerating while the other struggles to keep up. It's that the very same wave of technology is propelling the rich forward while pushing poorer countries backward. For decades, globalization had worked off a familiar script. Lower-income countries could catch up by specializing in industries where cost mattered most. Textiles and electronics assembly were the pathways in the 1980s and 90s, and by the 2000s, outsourced services became the next big entry point. If a nation could train a workforce fluent in English or technically capable of handling support tickets, they could plug into global markets, attract contracts, and build middle-class jobs in the process. The formula was straightforward. Advanced economies created demand, developing economies met it with cheaper labor. But the rise of AI short-circuits that formula altogether. The tasks once handed down to cheaper markets are now being handled by machines in the very countries that generated the demand in the first place. This dynamic is especially stark because it doesn't follow the old pattern of industrial migration. When factories mechanized, they still had to be operated somewhere, giving new participants a chance at growth as production moved to lower-wage regions. AI doesn't require that kind of physical relocation. Software systems can run on servers in California or Seoul and deliver services worldwide. Instead of redistributing opportunity, they concentrate it where the technology is designed, owned, and financed. The numbers illustrate this concentration. In 2025, US GDP growth topped 4%, well above the global average, supported by AI-driven productivity gains and sharp rises in corporate profitability. Germany reported similar improvements, as automation streamlined not just manufacturing, but the entire logistics and design chain that supports it. South Korea consolidated its position as a technology hub, boosting exports of AI systems across Asia and beyond. Even in China, where adoption strategies differ, projections suggest AI will still contribute significant additions to national output. By contrast, countries heavily reliant on service outsourcing, such as the Philippines or Bangladesh, reported stagnant or even negative growth once contracts dried up. And despite efforts to diversify, no replacement industries appeared with the scale or speed required to offset those sudden losses. Independent economic modeling backs up these trends. Analysts at Penn Wharton Budget Model noted that while AI is projected to generate modest aggregate increases in global GDP levels, the distribution of those benefits will not be even. Advanced economies, particularly those that already own the platforms and intellectual property, are expected to capture the overwhelming majority of gains. The US and China alone account for a disproportionate share of projected AI-driven growth, while low-income nations are forecast to see limited benefits, if any at all. It amounts to a reshuffling of global wealth toward the economies with the greatest capital, research ecosystems, and domestic demand. For developing nations, the shift cuts twice. They lose income from contracts that once paid millions of wages, and at the same time they see new consumer spending power concentrated elsewhere. A data entry specialist in Dhaka once earned through foreign contracts, then spent those wages in local shops and contributed taxes for infrastructure. Today, that same work is often licensed directly from AI firms in the US or Europe, upstreaming much of the profit back to advanced economies. Local communities are left with fewer paychecks, weaker local businesses, and shrinking tax bases. Industry reporting has already documented this repatriation of services. Firms that once outsourced customer support to call centers abroad are now handling the same interactions domestically, powered by AI platforms that require only a handful of supervisors rather than thousands of agents abroad. For corporations, this reduces coordination costs and keeps intellectual property under tighter control. For developing economies, it erases one of the most reliable growth models of the past 30 years in a matter of months. The pace is what troubles many economists. Earlier industrial shifts allowed time for adjustment, with decades separating major phases of mechanization and offshoring. With AI, transitions arrive in compressed cycles. A project can replace workers globally overnight, no factories or shipping lanes required. Countries that built up entire urban infrastructures around a flow of service contracts are now discovering those projects can disappear with the deployment of a single software update. The ladder that once allowed one country after another to climb toward middle-income status no longer exists in the same form. Meanwhile, the advantages to wealthier nations compound on themselves. Increased productivity widens corporate profits, generating more taxable income that governments can reinvest into research, education, and infrastructure. That reinvestment accelerates adoption further, reinforcing the lead. Add to that the global talent magnet effect. Highly skilled workers from around the world now concentrate around AI hubs such as San Francisco, Seoul, and Berlin, amplifying both innovation and inequality. Developing countries face the inverse: brain drain, capital flight, and rising difficulty in negotiating for trade or investment on favorable terms. The promise that globalization might eventually lift all boats looks weaker every month. Instead of incremental convergence between economies, 2025 shows divergence accelerating. Richer countries accelerating upward, while those dependent on services struggle to even maintain their place. The IMF's warnings about exposure in outsourcing-heavy nations and commentaries from institutions such as the World Bank underscore the risk. Countries that once relied on service exports to fuel growth may now turn into net losers from the AI revolution. This is why many refer to the period as a turning point. What made globalization predictable, repeatable ladders of industrial development, has splintered under the weight of automation. The gains are clustering around a small set of countries, and for those outside that circle, the route forward looks uncertain. The result is not just an economic imbalance, but an amplification of political and social inequality across the global map. And while these shifts across nations are striking, they raise a deeper issue still closer to home. If global wealth is separating so sharply between countries, what does that same pattern look like inside national economies themselves? So what happens inside those countries, and inside your wallet, when those jobs disappear? The new economic class system. Inside national economies, AI is no longer just an industry issue. It has become a dividing line that reshapes class structures. Economists once described inequality through lenses like education, geography, or access to capital. But in 2025, a sharper boundary has appeared. Those who can use AI to augment their work are advancing, while those whose roles can be fully replaced are watching their careers evaporate. This is the new economic class system, defined not by traditional credentials, but by proximity to algorithmic tools. Wage and employment data highlight the split. Workers in high-skill occupations who incorporate AI tools are seeing career acceleration and tangible wage premiums. Consulting firms like McKinsey report that demand for AI fluency is rising across industries, and employers are rewarding that competence more than seniority alone. By contrast, workers in highly exposed roles, call centers, routine clerical jobs, basic media production, are being displaced outright. Instead of incremental wage growth, they face job elimination. These aren't hypotheticals. Companies in financial services, law, and software development already rely on smaller teams producing more output with AI at their side, while parallel departments in customer service or transcription vanish in months. One illustration is enough to capture the divergence. Picture an early career analyst who knows how to prompt and guide AI software. In months, she is able to deliver what once required entire teams. Her output is noticed, and her career prospects rise quickly. Sitting elsewhere in the same company, colleagues in client support are phased out as AI bots handle queries around the clock. Neither story is unusual. Both are now widespread patterns visible across many sectors. Research confirms that early career workers in exposed jobs feel the brunt of these changes. Studies from the St. Louis Fed and Stanford have shown that younger workers in AI-susceptible occupations experience the steepest early employment declines, eroding career ladders before they even had time to form. At the same time, data shows AI-skilled workers capturing new opportunities across roles traditionally considered safe, from legal review to consulting. The result is not just a pay gap, but an entirely new form of occupational segregation inside the same companies and industries. Two parallel economies now operate under one roof, one built on augmentation, the other on substitution. This dynamic also alters workplace hierarchies. In previous eras, promotions favored tenure or advanced degrees. Now, proficiency with AI can thrust less experienced employees into supervisory roles, sometimes leapfrogging over mid-career colleagues. The effect is visible in reduced relevance of credentials and greater emphasis on skill demonstration. Managers who once expected their seniority to protect them now watch younger, AI-fluent recruits take control of workflows. The career ladder itself feels unstable, tilting toward those who master these tools quickly. Generational tensions deepen the fault line. Digital native younger workers adapt more readily, while older workers face the steepest risk. A 20-something can climb rapidly by integrating AI. A 40-something with years of steady but repetitive experience may find it impossible to reconfigure their professional identity. Researchers have repeatedly confirmed this generational tilt, noting that early career employees in exposed sectors absorb the harshest shocks. The class system of 2025 does not only separate job categories, it stratifies age groups within them. The material impacts go beyond paychecks. Workers who succeed with AI enjoy stronger bargaining positions, easier access to credit, and greater housing security. Those excluded face cascading disadvantages. economic instability, stalled savings, health coverage gaps, and reliance on gig work for survival. In effect, AI doesn't just draw a line between types of jobs. It creates two divergent standards of living in the same country. Previous policies, education subsidies, tax assistance, retraining vouchers, look inadequate against the speed of this shift. If technology adoption compresses decades into a handful of years, social protections designed for slow transitions fail to keep up. The comparison to earlier industrial disruption has limits. When factories automated, many workers could transition into lower-skill service jobs. But with AI, those service pathways often constitute the first layer of roles eliminated. The leap needed to move from a displaced customer representative to an AI product analyst is steep, and conventional training pipelines don't close the gap fast enough. This produces a three-tiered system. At the top, those who design and direct AI. In the middle, roles still safe due to complexity and judgment. And at the bottom, jobs instantly reproducible by algorithms. The ladder between tiers is not broken, it is vanishing. Some sociologists highlight the social fabric tearing under this pressure. Workers who thrive with AI skills connect in tight networks, conferences, and online groups, reinforcing shared influence. Displaced workers cluster separately, struggling through short-term jobs or retraining schemes that often trail behind technological realities. Both groups may live in the same cities, but participate in entirely separate economies. From household consumption patterns to voting behaviors, the divide shows up everywhere. Equally significant is how rapidly this structure has emerged. In the past, social class formation took generations, tied to long industrial transformations. With AI, sharp divides appear in under 5 years. This speed accelerates the sense of precarity. Families who once believed they had secured stability through office jobs are facing sudden collapse. Conversations about inequality no longer exist only in lecture halls. They are playing out around dinner tables and in company break rooms. At its core, this new class system is built around a simple shift. The measure of value is no longer years, degrees, or location. It is the ability to harness algorithmic capability. Workers fluent in turning AI into leverage rise fast. Workers whose tasks are replicable by AI are replaced. And unlike previous transformations, the gap is less about effort and more about access to the right skills at the right moment. That makes it harder for individual resilience to offset structural odds. By the end of 2025, it's clear that the domestic workforce is divided into two distinct categories: augmented workers and substituted workers. One group scales its output with new tools, garners wage premiums, and accelerates careers. The other faces job erosion, stalled opportunity, and declining security. The divide inside nations now mirrors the international one, reinforcing inequality at multiple levels. But if inequality within countries feels sharper than ever, it also serves as a reminder of how wrong early assumptions about AI proved to be. For years, the narrative promised assistance rather than replacement. As the evidence now shows, that promise didn't hold. Predictions that aged poorly. Back in 2023, many prominent voices in policy, business, and consulting argued that artificial intelligence would operate more as an assistant than a replacement. The message was reassuring. Machines would handle repetitive tasks while humans continued to hold on to the higher-order skills, decision-making, judgment, empathy, that supposedly made us secure. Analysts leaned on historical parallels. When factories industrialized, people shifted into managing or servicing those machines. When the internet changed office work, new professions like digital marketing or IT support expanded to absorb displaced workers. It seemed natural to assume AI would follow the same trajectory. But 2 years later, much of that confidence looks misplaced. Early workforce studies from 2023 illustrate how quickly assumptions crumbled. Many predicted that only about 40% of service occupations faced serious automation risk, while the majority were thought to be protected by creativity, nuance, or interpersonal skills. Yet updated figures from 2025 show that in some service-heavy sectors, automation exposure runs far higher than expected, with actual adoption happening in condensed time frames. Businesses that were predicted to slowly pare down their headcount over decades instead cut entire departments within a single budget cycle. Researchers at the Penn-Wharton budget model had initially simulated adoption curves where AI diffused gradually. Their more recent analysis shows that diffusion occurred far faster, compressing the window in which workers and governments could prepare. One of the main reasons forecasts aged poorly is the dramatic pace of machine learning advances. In 2023, the assumption was that model training and deployment would remain constrained by computing costs and slow iteration. Instead, hardware efficiency scaled quickly, costs fell, and new model generations arrived months apart. By 2025, large systems were not simply generating text. They were writing production-ready code, coordinating customer interactions, and producing administrative outputs at a consistency that analysts had thought was still years away. Software that was supposed to serve as a side tool instead landed as a ready-made substitute. Consider customer support as an example. Predictions only 2 years ago suggested mature adoption was a decade away, citing customer frustration with primitive chatbots. Instead, satisfaction surveys in 2025 record higher resolution scores from automated systems than from human teams. Banks, airlines, and online retailers responded by cutting staff far earlier than expected. Coding provides another case. Entry-level programmers were told their jobs were relatively resilient, since models could handle only snippets of simple code. Today, systems assemble entire applications with minimal human intervention. Universities producing fresh software engineers discovered that junior roles disappeared even before their students graduated. Administrative support jobs, long thought safe due to organizational familiarity, have also been hollowed out as Office AI performs scheduling, reporting, and documentation at scale. Across industries, jobs predicted to be safe became the first to be substituted. Looking back at the tone of older reports, what stands out is the optimism. Forecasters stressed complementarity, emphasizing that new jobs would arise to balance those lost. In theory, that claim is still valid, but in practice, the distribution of new opportunities remains narrow. The fastest-growing AI-related roles in 2025 are highly specialized consulting and integration jobs. Thousands of businesses advertise for AI adoption strategists or compliance auditors, but these roles typically go to professionals with advanced credentials, not to the displaced workers from call centers or clerical offices. Jobs were created, but not on a scale or in a form that replaced what was lost. Corporate adoption behavior also unfolded differently than forecasts suggested. Reports from 2023 implied firms would roll out AI cautiously to minimize reputational and operational risks. The real dynamic was more competitive. As soon as one company demonstrated major cost savings from automation, rivals felt pressured to follow. The domino effect left no space for slower, deliberate transitions. By mid-2025, industry after industry saw rapid contraction in staff-intensive roles. The assumption that corporations would self-regulate adoption speed looks overly naive once stacked against shareholder pressure and financial targets. Some of the boldest claims in 2023 focused on human empathy as an unassailable edge. Economists and consultants argued that customers would always prefer authentic interaction, even if AI handled routine queries. Yet after systems were trained on millions of hours of conversational data, their ability to mimic pacing and tone improved enough to change perception. Consumers prioritized efficiency and reliability. Polls in 2025 show rising acceptance of AI interlocutors, with the added advantage that they don't transfer calls, lose focus, or keep people on hold. Businesses recognized that good enough was, in practice, better than humans operating at scale. The supposed moat of uniquely human emotional labor narrowed quickly. Taken together, what collapsed were the moderate forecasts. In 2023, analysts typically offered 3 scenarios: optimistic, moderate, and pessimistic. The middle scenario, gradual adoption with balanced job creation, dominated public discussion. 2 years later, outcomes are far closer to the pessimistic case. Substitution large enough to unsettle core sectors, new roles too limited to absorb displaced labor, and adoption timelines compressed dramatically. It is not universal destruction of jobs, but the reassuring middle ground no longer looks accurate. Both PWBM modeling and labor market data support that reality, and studies from the St. Louis Fed show early statistical links between AI exposure of an occupation and subsequent employment declines, especially among younger workers. It is important to stress that forecasters weren't deliberately misinforming. Many drew legitimately from patterns of past industrial revolutions. But AI differs in kind, not just degree. Factory machines started in specific plants and spread slowly due to capital and infrastructure costs. Internet technology still required training, hardware rollout, and years for norms to stabilize. AI software scales on infrastructure that already exists, servers and networks spanning the globe. Diffusion occurs nearly instantly. Underestimating that speed was the critical error across much of the 2023 commentary. The impact of those missed forecasts is wide-ranging. Workers plan careers under the assumption of safe ladders. Governments calibrated budgets on timelines that now look outdated. Investors expected adoption arcs slower than what materialized. Today, those misjudgments force rushed retraining programs, early ballooning of unemployment aid, and corporate hiring plans overturned in months. Moderate predictions acted as sedatives. They dulled urgency when urgency was required. By 2025, hindsight shows that the pace of transition demands faster planning and swifter adaptation than traditional playbooks allow. For viewers, the constructive takeaway is simple but urgent. Planning horizons are shorter than you might expect. If you are considering reskilling or shifting industries, do not assume that you have decades to prepare. Studies like those from PWBM and the Fed highlight how quickly exposure translates into employment outcomes. In exposed fields, the timeline is measured in years, sometimes even months. That reality matters for decisions made right now. And while learning which comforting forecasts fell apart is sobering, it also highlights another side of the story that gets less attention. For every role automated away, entirely new categories of work have appeared in 2025, roles barely anyone had listed 2 years ago. Understanding those emerging niches is critical because they may hold some of the unexpected opportunities that still exist. The jobs nobody saw coming. It's tempting to dwell on the jobs disappearing because the scale of the losses is easy to see. Millions of roles gone, entire sectors collapsing. But alongside that collapse, something less obvious has taken shape. By 2025, a handful of new professions have appeared that few would have identified even a couple of years ago. They are not sweeping replacements for the millions of call center agents or transcription workers who lost livelihoods, but they are signals of how economies adapt in unusual ways. These roles are strange, often hybrid, and they only make sense in a world where human oversight and machine intelligence constantly overlap. One of the clearest examples is the AI behavior auditor. Their work is part quality assurance, part risk analysis, and part ethics. Instead of running safety checks on factories or appliances, they monitor the outputs of powerful models, tracking when responses tilt toward bias, misinformation, or unsafe suggestions. MIT and World Economic Forum research has emphasized that as AI grows more complex, oversight and explainability become critical for public trust and regulatory compliance. That's exactly the domain of these auditors. The skill set is unusual, coding literacy matters, but so does an ability to spot misleading logic, anticipate unintended impacts, and exercise judgment in gray areas. In other words, it demands a combination of technical awareness, social science, and ethical instinct that no single background fully provides. Another new role is the prompt library curator. Early on, poorly written prompts wasted hours or produced absurd results. By mid-2025, firms realized that managing prompts could make or break productivity, leading them to hire specialists who catalog, refine, and update libraries of effective instructions. McKinsey noted that hybrid roles focused on human-AI complementarity are becoming central, and this is a prime case. Curators blend process management with linguistic nuance. They not only maintain repositories, but also track performance across different model versions and train colleagues to use prompts consistently. The hybrid skills required, organizational discipline, basic technical literacy, and communication training, don't resemble traditional programming. Instead, they look closer to a fusion of librarianship, workflow design, and professional coaching. Then there's the AI personality designer. This is where branding and psychology intersect with code. Companies quickly learned that user response depends heavily on tone. Bank clients want serious, reliable answers. Entertainment users prefer wit and playfulness. The designer's job is to shape conversational style so that machine responses fit a brand identity without unsettling users. World Bank and WEF reports have both stressed that as AI becomes more embedded in public-facing roles, human oversight of tone and trustworthiness is not optional. These designers embody that principle. Skills here include creative writing, cultural awareness, and applied psychology, layered on top of enough technical understanding to tweak systems without breaking them. It is essentially character development work, applied to machine agents expected to handle millions of daily interactions. Similar but distinct is the digital human trainer. These workers focus not on a single line or brief conversation, but on sustained, complex simulations. Virtual tutors, wellness coaches, or interactive companions require consistency across many hours of engagement. Trainers guide systems to stay in character, avoid drift, and reflect human values over long periods. The job requires a patient management style, akin to supervising staff, but applied to networks that shift behavior subtly over time. Industry observers from Penn Wharton and SuperAGI have highlighted the rise of agentic models that act autonomously for extended tasks. Trainers provide the guardrails. Essential skills include patience, communication structures, ethical reasoning, and close tracking of patterns over vast interaction logs. 2 years ago, this looked like science fiction. Now it appears in mainstream contracts and payrolls. What unifies all of these is not just that they are new, but that they occupy the overlap between human judgment and machine efficiency. Research from McKinsey and the World Bank stresses that the most resilient new roles demand hybrid skills, mixes of technical fluency, critical thinking, and ethical reasoning. Workers who can read code but also notice when an algorithm sounds off, who can write a clear prompt but also manage language across cultural contexts, rise fastest. These jobs are not narrow tasks. They are connectors, ensuring automation remains functional, reliable, and safe in environments where error margins are small. By linking directly to these roles, one can see the broader pattern. Adaptation does happen, but on scales smaller than hoped. Reports from ILO and McKinsey remind us that while new roles are appearing, they cannot yet absorb job losses of millions. An AI prompt curator may command strong wages, but that role cannot substitute for hundreds of call center positions erased in a single software rollout. The imbalance matters. While it proves that human AI jobs are real, it also shows their limits. Economies do not replace removed jobs one-to-one. Instead, they fracture, with narrow niches delivering value in highly specific places, while large groups of displaced workers still search for openings. Still, it's worth recognizing the odd texture these professions add to everyday work life. Try explaining them to family. I get paid to check if a neural network is polite, or I supervise a chatbot's long-term attitude. They sound absurd, like punchlines, but companies are posting salaries and building departments around them. Entire teams are dedicated to etiquette coaching for machines because reputational risk is real. One bad answer in a sensitive setting can cost millions, so the oversight jobs have full institutional weight. Futuristic or not, it becomes clear these roles are practical responses to practical risks. The paradox is unavoidable. Automation eliminates vast categories of standard jobs, but at the same time it gives shape to occupations that never had names. Just as the early internet created positions like digital marketing or search optimization, this wave has produced job titles blending creativity, ethics, and machine supervision. They size up as small in number but large in influence. Without them, the systems fail to operate safely. The fact that they appear quickly, with little academic training pipeline, shows how workplace demand can invent career tracks, seemingly out of thin air. For workers today, the critical point is to pay attention to these strange niches. Not every role is attainable, but each reflects a direction where opportunity grows. A mix of technical literacy, communication ability, and ethical reasoning underpins all the examples. Precisely the combination that researchers argue will be hardest to automate completely. That combination offers not just employment but leverage, the ability to stand alongside rather than beneath automation. Of course, none of this softens the losses felt elsewhere. For every person earning a paycheck as a behavior auditor, thousands are still searching for work displaced in outsourcing or clerical support. The scale problem persists, and governments remain behind in supporting transitions. But the lesson from these quirky titles is that the workforce is mutating, not simply shrinking. For individuals able to shift quickly, the path forward is not linear retraining into safe sectors, but pursuing these intermediate, hybrid functions. So on a practical note, Consider one role that resonates with your existing strengths, whether auditing, communication, creative shaping, or training, and keep it in mind as we move ahead. Because the next challenge is not just seeing which jobs appear, but deciding how to respond before the gap between substitution and augmentation pulls too far apart, adapting or getting left behind. Not everyone facing AI's disruption in 2025 ends up at a dead end, even if it can feel that way. The reality is that long-term stability no longer comes from holding one job for decades. It comes from learning how to pivot before technology renders a role obsolete. Workers are discovering that standing still is essentially falling behind. And while not every displaced employee can leap effortlessly into a new profession, those who treat adaptability itself as a core skill are the ones who are making it through. The way retraining looks today is very different from what governments or employers imagined just a few years ago. Older programs focused narrowly on swapping one career for another, like guiding factory hands into electrical maintenance or moving teachers into project management. What we now see in 2025 is that retraining has to point at something broader, building skills machines still struggle to replicate. This doesn't mean avoiding technology. It means learning to use it while also developing capabilities like critical thinking, creativity, and problem-solving in ambiguous situations. World Bank and IMF researchers emphasize that these human-first skills carry lasting economic value because they remain difficult to automate. Take problem-solving as an example. An AI tool might generate half a dozen solutions to a supply chain issue, but deciding which one is viable in the context of cultural norms, ethical considerations, or political realities still requires human judgment. Creativity behaves the same way. Although models generate endless recombinations of text or images, genuine originality still comes from people pushing against conventions. These qualities may sound abstract, but research points to them as precisely the areas where humans continue to outperform even the most advanced models. To make this practical, viewers should think in terms of 3 clear pivots backed by current research. First, aim for AI-fluent augmentation roles, jobs where you learn and apply AI tools directly in your existing field. McKinsey stresses the rising importance of general AI literacy, which doesn't require advanced coding, but does require knowing how to guide, critique, and manage machine output. Second, build on human-first strengths like communication, creativity, and critical thinking. These are repeatedly highlighted by the World Bank and IMF as essential buffers against substitution. Third, consider infrastructure and technical support roles connected to the expansion of AI. Things like data engineering, hardware maintenance, or edge computing jobs. The U.S. Department of Labor and other policy studies have emphasized these as areas of persistent demand, since AI adoption requires physical networks, storage, and systems upkeep. Having a sense of where to pivot is one thing, knowing how to make the move is another. The learn to code mantra of the last decade needs serious updating. Coding still carries value, but manual syntax alone is no longer a strong foundation. Boot camps in 2025 joke that they don't just teach JavaScript, they teach you how not to be replaced by JavaScript. The humor works because career mobility now comes from understanding how to manage AI-written code, not from memorizing commands line by line. Workers who can guide, refine, and correct AI-generated outputs transition naturally into higher-value positions, while those who avoid the tools altogether find themselves stuck competing against the software directly. The most effective approach is to treat adaptability as the baseline skill. Think of adaptability as a currency. The more you can retrain, re-experiment, and shift focus, the more valuable you remain in any workplace. A project manager who quickly learns how to use AI tools for scheduling, then applies them for budgeting, and later adapts them for risk analysis proves their capacity to grow with the technology. That adaptability multiplies their value across time. Compare this with someone who resists using the tools at all. Even if they work hard, their unwillingness to adapt makes them more replaceable. Of course, not everyone has the same opportunity to adapt. Access to reliable broadband, affordable training, and supportive policy matter enormously. Both the World Bank and IMF warn that digital infrastructure gaps risk leaving entire regions behind, even if workers are motivated to learn. The availability of training programs is equally uneven. In Scandinavia, government-backed initiatives are embedding AI literacy into school curricula, ensuring young workers enter the job market equipped with baseline skills. In East Asia, mid-career professionals can attend subsidized programs that foster AI fluency while protecting their income. By contrast, workers in countries without such institutional support often cannot afford to stop working long enough to reskill. This is why workers should be strategic in seeking out training. Research highlights the importance of accessible, low-cost options. Free courses from tech firms, national AI workforce hubs, and government-run training centers can all serve as entry points. The priority areas are clear: AI literacy, domain-specific application of tools, prompt engineering basics, and soft skill development such as communication and collaboration. Without reliable broadband and digital infrastructure, retraining remains out of reach, which is why programs that couple upskilling with infrastructure expansion, like some U.S. Department of Commerce initiatives, are so critical. For viewers, the simplest action is to check what your local government, trade body, or employer already offers. Many have quietly begun running AI training subsidies or free online modules. Another key feature of adaptation is blending technical fluency with distinctively human context. Programs that focus solely on software training often fall short. More effective models teach both the technical basics and the complementary skills needed to make outputs meaningful. For instance, design students don't just learn how to run generative art tools. They train to critique and contextualize the results so the final work resonates with real audiences. This pattern, pairing efficiency with sense-making, is the hallmark of human-AI collaboration. McKinsey and WEF commentaries repeatedly underline this dual-skill approach. Mastery is not measured by speed or raw output, but by the ability to shape machine-driven results into outcomes that align with human needs. Still, the hard truth remains that millions cannot retrain quickly enough, and some will never access the right programs in time. For those who do manage the transition, it is less about completely avoiding the reach of AI and more about stepping into niches where machine limitations demand human collaboration. Success means positioning yourself as an interpreter, a guide, or an ethical filter, roles that cannot be fully substituted yet. In that sense, adaptability is more than ambition. It is a survival strategy in economies where job descriptions can change overnight. This also changes what career security looks like. In past decades, people measured success by sticking with a single employer or climbing within a well-defined profession. The pattern in 2025 is far more fluid. Workers may shift from one AI-resistant niche to another, building resilience with each change rather than permanence. For some, jumping repeatedly feels destabilizing. For others, it feels liberating. Either way, the requirement remains the same. Thrive by accepting constant change as the default, not the exception. What follows from this is that security itself has been redefined. It now comes less from the title on a business card and more from the capacity to pivot, apply judgment in unpredictable contexts, and create value that machines cannot generate alone. Adaptability functions like a modern currency. You invest in it, accumulate it, and use it to unlock opportunities. Those who carry it forward gain leverage in tomorrow's economy. Without it, even talented and dedicated workers risk being left behind. The question, of course, is whether individuals alone can shoulder the weight of this transition. To make adaptability possible at scale, larger institutions often need to provide safety nets, funding, and infrastructure. Which brings us to the bigger issue. What happens when whole industries vanish at once, and governments must decide whether to step in or stand aside? When governments step in, or don't, government responses to AI disruption in 2025 look less like a unified strategy and more like a patchwork of experiments. Some countries treat automation as a crisis that requires direct public intervention, while others treat it as a market force to be absorbed over time. The variation is striking, and the outcomes for citizens increasingly depend on where they live. Europe offers some of the more visible examples of direct protection. Several states launched large retraining subsidies, giving workers months of paid time to study new fields without their families falling into poverty in the process. Governments there frame worker adaptability as public infrastructure, much like roads or energy. Training initiatives emphasize sectors not easily automated: elder care, teaching support, community health, and certain creative industries. Officials admit these programs are costly, but they argue that failing to protect against mass unemployment would ultimately cost even more in social spending, unrest, and tax revenue shortfalls. In Asia, the Philippines is often cited for its attempt to plan ahead through its national AI roadmap. IMF commentary highlights that the country identified its business process outsourcing sector as especially exposed and started building policy proposals aimed at retraining and diversifying the workforce. The roadmap links AI adoption with workforce development by emphasizing education, digital infrastructure, and formal retraining pipelines. Whether these policies scale in time remains uncertain, but the strategy shows that governments can view AI as both an opportunity and a threat worth managing proactively. By contrast, reporting from Bangladesh mentions draft strategies but points out delays in implementation, leaving workers more vulnerable to immediate losses. The United States presents a different model. The White House's AI Action Plan prioritizes leadership in adoption while adding workforce protection measures at the margins. Outlined initiatives include national workforce hubs, funding for AI research, and strategies to integrate training more broadly. At the same time, adoption incentives push companies forward quickly. The result resembles a balancing act. Rapid investment in AI's commercial rollout alongside uneven coverage of support systems. Many programs are available, but they vary by region. Some state governments, such as California and Colorado, have gone further with proposals or regulations governing AI hiring and employment practices, creating local rules to fill gaps left at the federal level. Universal basic income is another experiment governments use to confront AI displacement more directly. Although still small in scope, pilot programs began distributing flat monthly payments to citizens regardless of job status. Results so far suggest people use the money not only on rent and groceries, but also for short retraining programs or small-scale entrepreneurial projects. Proponents emphasize that UBI offers stability when work itself becomes unpredictable. Critics warn about costs and dependency. No consensus exists, but the very act of piloting the idea underscores that policymakers understand traditional job markets alone may not carry future economies. Infrastructure is also emerging as a major dividing line. Retraining workers requires widespread digital access, yet many regions still treat broadband as a private luxury instead of essential public infrastructure. Countries that invest heavily in high-speed networks, like South Korea or some northern European states, give their citizens stronger foundations for participating in AI-centered economies. In places that lag, inequality deepens as opportunities cluster around cities or regions with better coverage. IMF and World Bank warnings highlight that failing to close digital gaps risks excluding entire communities, no matter how strong their motivation to adapt. The contrast between promotion and precaution is often sharp. Some governments accelerate adoption with tax incentives and corporate subsidies, prioritizing growth and efficiency over disruptions to employment. The argument stresses competitiveness. If one nation slows down, others will fill the gap. Yet the immediate cost is visible at the local level, where workers lose paychecks, cities lose spending power, and households lose stability. Other governments move more cautiously, setting rules to delay automation rollouts without transition plans. Both strategies carry risks, but the citizen experience differs dramatically depending on which path their country chooses. Another recurring theme is the gap between rhetoric and actual implementation. Leaders speak of inclusive AI, or AI for all, but behind the podiums the details often remain stalled in committees or underfunded in budgets. Workers see announcements of fairness and protection, but actual retraining seats or subsidies are fewer than the demand. The mismatch magnifies frustration as corporations replace jobs within months while governments respond over years. Federal versus regional responsibility compounds these gaps. In the United States, workforce protections differ between states. California pilots AI hiring transparency laws, while other states offer no equivalent safeguards. In Europe, countries with strong welfare states absorb shocks more easily than neighbors struggling with budget constraints. Inside India, policies differ between states with aggressive digital infrastructure investments and those lagging behind. The result is that one worker may receive structured retraining support while another, across a provincial border, faces job loss alone. Economic differences quickly translate into political dynamics. Governments that invest visibly, even imperfectly, tend to maintain higher levels of public trust. Citizens may endure disruption with less hostility if they believe leaders share the burden. Where promises come without policies, discontent has already produced strikes, protests, and surging support for anti-establishment parties. Analysts caution that mismanaging AI transitions could destabilize traditional political coalitions faster than many leaders expect. International comparisons further reinforce the consequences. A nation like the Philippines, with its public roadmap and early retraining pilots, positions itself as a candidate for global investors who value stability. Meanwhile, countries with patchy strategies become less attractive for both capital and talent, leading to migration outward rather than innovation inward. These choices directly influence whether a workforce remains anchored in future industries or pushes its young professionals abroad. What matters for individual workers is not only whether they can adapt, but also whether their governments create the conditions to help them adapt quickly. Policy determines whether retraining is accessible, whether broadband is reliable, whether safety nets are there when contracts evaporate. For viewers, the most practical takeaway is to look at your own country's commitments now. If retraining programs exist, use them. If digital infrastructure projects are underway, position yourself to take advantage. If none of these policies are visible, understand that relying solely on personal resilience will be much harder. The sharpest reality is that private incentives drive companies to adopt AI at maximum speed. Without counterweights, those incentives naturally converge toward concentration of wealth and power. Governments can balance that by investing in widespread adaptation, or they can ignore it and let inequality widen rapidly. The evidence so far shows both approaches happening side by side across the world. Policies, whether ambitious or cautious, do more than set economic trajectories. They shape day-to-day lives. They determine whether displaced workers find pathways back into stability, or whether entire communities watch opportunity disappear. Much of the public still hears AI described as a technology story, but governments make it equally a political one, dictating whether transitions turn into crises or into manageable adjustments. And yet, policy only sets the ground rules. It doesn't settle what work itself will look like. Even in countries moving quickly to retrain or provide safeguards, workers are finding something more complex. That survival isn't only about protection, but also about learning how to work with these tools in real time. Humans and AI, strange but successful partnerships. For all the headlines about disappearing jobs, there's another part of the AI story worth attention. In some fields, machines aren't pushing humans out. They're acting more like unusual colleagues. Tireless, fast, sometimes insightful, and occasionally unreliable. People who have learned to turn these systems into partners rather than competitors are showing a different path. These collaborations don't remove human work, they rearrange it. And the shift is already visible across medicine, education, and finance. Medicine offers one of the clearest demonstrations. Diagnostic AI now scans medical images in seconds, flagging potential issues that could take doctors hours to identify. Partnerships like those between Mayo Clinic researchers and IBM tools highlight how these systems raise accuracy and speed. But probability is not certainty, and that's where physicians remain central. A flagged shadow on a lung scan still requires a doctor to weigh patient history, risk, and treatment options. What AI really does is lower the time spent on routine cases, freeing doctors to focus on complex decisions and conversations with patients. In practice, machines extend reach while humans safeguard judgment. Education shows something similar in a very different setting. Teachers spend large chunks of their week planning lessons, grading, and filling out reports. AI tutoring assistants, as noted in recent World Bank and WEF discussions, are already helping trim those hours by creating personalized study material and mapping student progress. A teacher still decides what's relevant, interprets results through first-hand knowledge of each child, and handles motivation and care. The machine generates possibilities. The teacher translates them into action that actually resonates in a classroom. The payoff is straightforward. Less energy lost to paperwork, more attention for struggling students. Finance follows the same partnership model. Analysts in banking and investment once spent days assembling mountains of data. Automated platforms now pre-sort that information, surfacing patterns that would have taken manual teams weeks. The analyst remains responsible for the call, factoring in market behavior, policy shifts, and client goals, but the groundwork is already prepared. Instead of reviewing endless spreadsheets, the human spends time weighing strategy. The balance isn't erasure, it's acceleration. What links these cases together is the division of labor. Machines handle scale and repetition, humans handle ambiguity, ethics, and social context. Research adds important nuance here. MIT Sloan studies note that human AI teams don't automatically outperform the best humans or the best machines alone. Their strongest value appears in tasks involving content creation, judgment calls, and translation of patterns into real-world meaning. In other words, collaboration pays off most in areas where neither side can deliver on its own. That dynamic does create quirks. Many workers describe AI as a perfect intern who never sleeps, capable of producing drafts and calculations at speed, while also prone to weird or occasionally nonsensical mistakes. The solution isn't to quit using the tool, but to design workflows that account for its flaws. Just as spreadsheets need double-checking and calculators can misfire, AI benefits from human oversight. The discipline lies in knowing when to lean on the system and when to intervene. This shifts how we think about skill. It isn't only that humans provide soft skills while machines provide computation. The examples show that judgment and empathy actually grow in importance. A medical image isn't valuable until a doctor integrates it with patient care. A teaching plan matters only when a teacher frames it for a child. A financial trend becomes actionable when a human ties it to wider cultural and political contexts. The machine narrows the field of options, but humans decide which to act on and bear responsibility for outcomes. Another advantage is time. Doctors unburdened from endless scan reviews can spend longer in patient dialogue. Teachers who save hours on grading can focus on students who need encouragement. Analysts freed from compiling reports can concentrate on strategy. Instead of running out of capacity, professionals redeploy effort into spaces software cannot easily reach. Even if the technology generates odd or impractical suggestions, editing them usually takes minutes compared to hours of manual work. Of course, some skepticism remains. Critics warn that corporations will steadily chip away at the human side once AI proves capable, aiming to save on payroll. That pattern is played out elsewhere, and it would be naive to dismiss it. Yet fields with high stakes, medicine, law, specialized finance, still face constraints. Patients demand that doctors, not algorithms, explain their diagnosis. Liability pushes law firms to ensure a professional signs off. Investors want someone accountable when decisions carry risk. Even with advanced systems, credibility still depends on human presence. This suggests a broader lesson. Not every form of automation is about making humans redundant. Sometimes it's about amplification. A teacher with AI support reaches more learners without losing the human connection. A doctor with diagnostic tools makes decisions faster and with higher confidence. A financial professional saves weeks of background work while sharpening their focus on outcomes. Neither side succeeds alone, but the blend creates a new equilibrium. For viewers, the real takeaway is that partnerships work best when framed as multipliers. Treat AI as a set of accelerators that handle repetitive or large-scale tasks, and reserve your own focus for the things they cannot capture: judgment, persuasion, creativity, and ethical decision-making. Ask yourself, which parts of your job could AI do faster, and which parts truly require you? That framework helps turn the tool from a threat into an amplifier. These collaborations don't erase the reality of displacement in other industries, but they prove something important: that the relationship between humans and AI doesn't have to default to replacement. When used with clarity and boundaries, the tools don't hollow out contributions, they concentrate them. Workers who recognize this balance early claim more influence over how value gets distributed. Those who ignore it risk being substituted instead of supported. Recognizing where AI fits into the workday sets up a larger question, though. If machines boost productivity and people maintain their roles through partnership, that might sound like balance restored. But there's a deeper challenge emerging on the economic side. If huge groups of workers aren't part of that balance at all, then even efficient collaboration raises a new problem, one that touches the entire way economies function: the consumer economy problem. If modern economies rely on people earning wages and then spending those wages to keep demand flowing, the question now facing 2025 is what happens when a growing share of people lose access to stable income. This is the core of what many economists are calling the consumer economy problem. Productivity numbers look strong as AI automates large swaths of service work, but in city neighborhoods and rural communities alike, incomes are shrinking. When households cut back, shopfronts empty out, and loan approvals tighten, the cycle that has fueled growth for 2 centuries starts to falter. The contradiction is easy to see. Companies generate more with fewer workers, their margins expand, their stock prices rise. Yet consumers, especially in the lower and middle tiers of the income scale, find it harder to participate in those same markets. The divergence between soaring corporate output and stagnant household demand has existed for decades, but over the past 2 years, it has accelerated sharply. McKinsey and others caution that without investment in how those gains are redistributed, productivity alone doesn't secure long-term growth. Growth only holds if there are still enough buyers to sustain it. Real-world numbers already hint at the strain. Several countries now report retail sales declining even as supply chains operate at near-perfect efficiency. Stores and delivery networks are stocked and optimized, but fewer orders come in. A paycheck once guaranteed by call center or clerical jobs has vanished, and gig work or retraining stipends rarely equal the previous income stream. For individuals, the result is less discretionary spending, fewer trips to restaurants, and smaller purchases at supermarkets. For businesses, it means less reliable revenue across the mass markets they once depended on. Conceptually, economists describe this as a hollowing effect. Productivity surges through AI tools, but that same surge strips out wages that would have fueled consumption. A cafe may automate drink making, but its potential customers are the very workers automation has displaced across the city. Automation raises supply capacity, yet demand contracts at the base. The imbalance produces growth on paper, but weakens demand in practice. As one Penn Wharton budget model analysis notes, failing to maintain demand alongside higher productivity creates long-term drag on GDP rather than sustained expansion. Earlier technological shifts softened this tension because workers usually moved into other sectors. Factory laborers replaced agricultural work, clerical jobs absorbed some displaced factory roles. Digital positions grew during the internet transition. Consumption stayed resilient as employment shifted. The difference in 2025 is the breadth of AI's reach. Instead of moving one sector at a time, AI moves horizontally, cutting across clerical work, logistics support, customer service, and even creative roles at the same moment. The result is abrupt declines in consumer demand in multiple areas without a compensating rise elsewhere. That drop in household demand hits financial systems too. Mortgages, student loans, and car purchases all assume stable employment. When banks see instability in the wider labor market, they respond by tightening credit. Families who once would have secured financing for homes or education find approvals harder to obtain. The effect cascades. Reduced borrowing weakens consumer markets even further, amplifying the very slowdown automation initiated. What was supposed to be an efficiency gain starts looking like an economy unable to circulate its own output. For younger adults, these dynamics show up in especially tough ways. Renters face fewer wage protections when service jobs disappear. First-time homebuyers discover mortgage approvals hinge not just on personal income, but on broader uncertainty about whole industries. Even when goods become cheaper thanks to efficient production, shrinking incomes mean affordability doesn't improve at the household level. The system that promised better living standards through efficiency begins to reverse its promise for many entering the workforce today. Some analysts suggest companies might eventually sustain themselves by catering primarily to high-income consumers, effectively narrowing their customer base while raising margins. Yet history offers caution. Mass-market capitalism has relied on large numbers of households, making regular purchases. Without that scale, overproduction or price collapse usually follows. Output piled high against a thinning consumer base risks creating stagnation cycles that undercut business performance across sectors. This isn't just a theoretical concern. Household surveys already show reduced spending on travel, entertainment, and major purchases. Luxury sectors continue to thrive, but the mass middle market, supermarkets, retail chains, household goods, shows signs of contraction. No matter how efficient automation makes production lines, abundance becomes less meaningful when the majority of households cannot afford the end product. The question then becomes how societies address the imbalance. Several possibilities are already on the table. Governments in some countries are strengthening unemployment insurance or expanding job retraining stipends tied to AI displacement. Others are experimenting with direct cash transfers or limited basic income pilots to support demand even as job markets shift. These policies remain small in scale, but they acknowledge that productivity without purchasing power undercuts stability. International bodies such as the IMF have noted that sustaining demand may prove just as vital to growth as expanding efficiency itself. What remains clear is that mass consumption was never simply a fortunate side effect of capitalism. It has been the foundation. Wages earned through work funded the very demand on which corporations relied. In 2025, automation is exposing what happens when that loop is disrupted. Companies may post record productivity gains, but if demand fails in enough markets simultaneously, the system that supported them across 2 centuries fractures. For ordinary people, this isn't abstract theory. It's rising rents colliding with stagnant wages, postponed house purchases, and fewer opportunities to build financial security. For policymakers, the concern is whether existing safety nets are built for a wave of displacement that moves faster than traditional welfare systems. And for companies, the dilemma is whether short-term automation gains offset the long-term risk of saturating markets that buyers can no longer sustain. All of this points toward a deeper issue. Economies aren't just measuring output anymore. They're testing the very assumptions that supported capitalism's expansion for generations. If productivity can soar while demand shrinks, the underlying rules no longer align. That tension sets the stage for a larger question. What happens to the framework of capitalism itself when human wages are no longer the center of its engine? The next chapter of capitalism. By mid-2025, the fault lines in the global economy suggest that capitalism itself may be approaching a turning point. For over 2 centuries, the system worked on the assumption that mass human labor was the foundation of value. Where there was work, there were wages, and where there were wages, there was demand to keep businesses running. But if advanced automation starts severing that link at scale, societies cannot avoid asking how production and consumption will stay connected. When labor is no longer the linchpin, the next chapter of capitalism looks very different. Research is beginning to outline 3 plausible paths that policymakers, businesses, and economists alike are debating. The first is a significant expansion of safety nets. This isn't just theory. The surge in pilot projects for direct cash transfers and limited basic income reflects growing recognition that stable wages are no longer guaranteed. Countries from Finland to South Korea have experimented with systems where households receive guaranteed monthly income, redistributing some of the gains produced by AI-driven productivity back into everyday spending power. The underlying aim is straightforward. If machines carry out much of the labor, governments ensure people still function as consumers. Economists at the IMF have noted that these moves are less ideological than practical. Sustained demand matters, and if wages dry up, redistribution becomes one of the few available stabilizers. The second path centers on taxation and profit-sharing models designed specifically for AI-driven productivity. Traditional tax systems target income and employment, but as automation reduces both, governments are testing ways to reach the new sources of value. Some experts propose levies linked to workforce reductions tied directly to automation, while others push for royalties on profits generated almost entirely from machine labor. Early versions of these ideas already appear in U.S. policy discussions tied to the White House's AI Action Plan, where lawmakers weigh how to ensure benefits flow more broadly instead of staying locked inside corporate margins. Academic commentary likewise stresses that if AI systems take on functions once paid to human workers, society may need to treat them much like taxable machinery in earlier industrial eras. Without such mechanisms, ownership gains become dangerously concentrated. That leads directly to the third scenario: consolidation of wealth around AI capital itself. Analysts at the Penn-Wharton budget model and IMF highlight that the commanding positions are already tilting toward those with control of cutting-edge algorithms, compute infrastructure, and proprietary datasets. In this model, the new elite may not be traditional industrialists or landowners, but institutions and investors holding licenses and ownership rights to AI systems. If that trend continues, wealth gaps could expand even faster than during prior industrial revolutions because machine labor generates value at high speed without requiring wages, benefits, or rest. Some economists even warn that ownership of computing power and AI models could emerge as the single most decisive source of income in decades to come. If redistribution or taxation fails to counterbalance this, entire populations risk exclusion from the main channels of wealth creation. Each of these scenarios brings different implications for both politics and society. Expanding safety nets demands political will and broad consensus, something many governments still lack. Taxation reforms risk pushback from corporations and investors who argue innovation will slow if profits face heavier redistribution. And consolidation of ownership, if left unchecked, could push democratic societies into crisis as economic benefits concentrate while the broad base of citizens loses both wages and bargaining power. The dividing line between adjustment and instability may depend less on technology itself and more on how policy frameworks catch up to it. The irony is that from a surface view, markets appear healthy. GDP growth in leading economies hits impressive percentages, stock prices for AI firms climb steadily, and corporate quarterly reports feature record profits. But behind the numbers, old assumptions start to look fragile. Capitalism, as practiced since the Industrial Revolution, relied on mass participation in work. If participation shrinks too much, redistribution or reinvention becomes less a matter of ideology and more a requirement for system survival. Where exactly the next phase leads remains uncertain, but clarity is growing on the options. Safety nets to cushion falling wages, tax systems recalibrated toward machine productivity, or a world where economic control concentrates almost entirely in the hands of AI capital owners. More likely, societies will experiment with some mixture of these approaches, each one testing how to reconnect supply, with demand in a world where human labor no longer drives the equation. For individuals, the implications reach far beyond abstract policy. Incomes, career security, and even civic identities have historically hinged on employment. If that changes, then rights and responsibilities may be redefined primarily through how citizens share in the productivity of machines. It's a question of legitimacy as much as of economics. How governments convince people that their stake in society continues even when traditional jobs vanish. Future outcomes will depend on the choices being made now. Do we maintain stability by protecting consumption through redistribution? Do we reshape taxation to capture new forms of value? Or do we risk watching ownership consolidate into an increasingly narrow set of hands? Each path shapes what rulebook capitalism operates under in the years ahead, and none avoid trade-offs. Which path do you think societies should take? Should governments tax AI-driven profits, expand universal safety nets, or attempt both at once? That decision is not abstract. It is the pivotal choice shaping the global economy's evolution. And with those choices looming, the urgency grows clearer. Technology is racing ahead faster than institutions. The outcomes are uneven, the impacts sharper, and the timeline shorter than most analysts predicted just a few years ago. AI's impact in 2025 is undeniable, and ignoring it is no longer an option. Survival at work depends less on resisting automation and more on learning how to work with it. This is not just about individual careers. It's also about how societies adjust as wealth grows less dependent on human labor. For now, 3 practical steps stand out. Check if your industry is flagged as high AI exposure using resources like OECD or IMF studies. Invest in AI literacy along with human strengths such as critical thinking and communication, and track local retraining programs or policy support. If you want a simple starting checklist, tap like and comment which industry you're in.